Good afternoon, Dr. Crystal and my fellow friends. Today, our group B6, will be presenting about the movie Thor Ragnarok. I would like to introduce my teammates first, which are me, Kui Shen, Song Qingfei, Liu Xing, Yong Wenling, Angel Tai Yiwen, and Ng Yi Yang. Without further ado, let's jump right into our presentation.
Hey everyone, have you guys watched Thor Ragnarok?
Oh yes, I did. It was a really funny movie and some of the scenes and elements made me wonder if there is any possibility that they might actually happen in real life.
Hey guys, I also watched the movie and oh my god, I can't stop getting lost in Chris Hemsworth's dreamy eyes.
Haha, same here. I love really hard edgy parts where Dr. Banner just slammed himself to the Bifrost Bridge. But I also can't help thinking about some of the scenes, such as the parts where Hellas was able to hold and even break Thor hammers into pieces.
Right, I was so shocked it makes me wonder if it is related to some sort of DNA identity recognition.
Oh, and also, the scene where Hela resurrects her wolf Fenris using the Eternal Flame. I really wonder if there's any advanced technology or research experiment that has proven death as an irreversible process.
From the movie, Thor's hammer Mjolnir were first processed by his sister Hela during Odin's conquest of the Nine Realms.
I don't think so. It's not possible.
Darling, you have no idea what's possible.
It was not stated clearly in the movie, but Hela and Thor would very likely be half-siblings, in which both are children of Odin. And it is known all individuals besides identical twins have their own unique set of DNA sequences, even though 99.9% of the sequences are identical between individuals. There is still a small amount of sequence that is distinctive and is usually focused on identity tests.
And since children will inherit 50% of their DNA from each biological parent, this means that half-siblings like Thor and Hela will share around 25% of their DNA. Therefore, we can suspect that Mjolnir could be lifted and wielded by anyone who has a certain percentage of Odin's DNA or has similar patterns of DNA bands as a result of their identity test.
So it's very possible that the hammer could perform DNA fingerprinting when a person comes into contact with it, using restriction enzymes to cut the strands of DNA into separated smaller segments unique between individuals. The segments are then sorted and appear as different patterns of DNA bands. A children will have a composite pattern of DNA bands of each of his parents. Therefore, through this method of isolation identification, Mjolnir could be able to identify the rightful owner that could wield it. I think this explains why Hela was able to lift Mjolnir without shedding a sweat.
However, it could not be possible, at least for now. DNA identification generally involves DNA fingerprinting, which is also known as DNA profiling. These advancements of techniques were not used until nearly 40 years ago in the 1980s when Sir Alex Jeffrey, professor in genetics at the University of Leicester in the UK, pioneered DNA-based identity testing. These techniques will locate and focus on widely varying sequences known as the variable number tendence repeats (VNTRS), in which only related individuals will be observing VNTRS loci, while unrelated individuals are almost impossible to achieve similar VNTRS.
Well, the general paternity test based on DNA would use markers, which are short tandem repeats, STRs. A person's DNA will contain 2 copies of these markers that were inherited from each of the parents. This entire process is also known as RFLP analysis and is enhanced with PCR technology. The reason that this instant DNA identity recognition seen in the movie is not possible, even with the most current and advanced technology, is because this entire procedure is still relatively time-consuming, requiring approximately 24 hours, which is a day, and can even take up to 3 to 5 days to turn the results around. Besides, there is still no evidence showing that we have successfully developed machinery or tools that are able to instantly extract, identify, and recognize our DNA sequences, or even run a paternity test just by being in contact with it, without the need to collect blood or any form of samples. Also, not to mention that Thor and Hela were not only able to wield the hammer, but also able to summon it from an extreme distance.
Ooh, I remember we have learned this before, and there are a few steps in this process. The first step is DNA fingerprinting. Will be extracting DNA from a sample specimen, usually saliva, blood, sperm, hair, or skin fragments. However, since such samples normally will only contain a very small amount of DNA, that is merely impossible for test and analysis. Hence, the DNA must be cleaved and purified from the cells. This could be accomplished through various procedures such as phenol, chloroform, and solid phase extraction. The restriction enzyme would then be introduced, which would function as a pair of scissors cutting the DNA into smaller fragments. These fragments are then amplified using polymerase chain reaction and separated by size through agarose gel electrophoresis and stained with ethylene bromide to visualize them. A slot is used to transfer DNA to a membrane, which is then bound to a radioactive DNA probe that is complementary to the sequence of the genome, allowing the pattern of DNA to be identified by washing away the excess probes and exposing the membrane to an X-ray film. The final outcome is a pattern of fluorescent DNA bands that resembles a barcode, with each person having their own unique set of DNA fingerprints.
Wow, I never thought that a scene in a movie could be linked to so many things that we have learned in the lectures. What about the scene where Hela resurrects her pet wolf Fenris?
Fenris, my darling, what have they done to you? With the eternal flame, you are reborn. I've missed you. I've missed you all.
That is also one of the scenes that gave me a deep impression, not just because of the size of the wolf, but also how Hela was able to bring the dead back to life. It is possible that this could be achieved through the preservation of the wolf's body perfectly, as it is pictured in the movie, where there was no sign of decomposition of Fenris' fur and body. It is also possible that her cells went through apoptosis, where is a classical regulatory mechanism involving cell suicide, which many cells have gone through. However, Hela's eternal flame may have acted as a culture medium or shock, inducing the cells of the dead wolf to undergo a process known as anaphylaxis and begin to revive themselves by reversing the apoptosis process, as well as restoring the damaged organelles and DNA, hence allowing the cells to effectively recover their structure and essential metabolic functions. Therefore, the cells can continue to grow and regain a regular cell cycle once again. But perhaps the wolf was only put in a temporary state, such as hibernation?
I would doubt that, since hibernation is when an organism's body goes into deep sleep for a long period of time and the heart rate, body temperature, and breathing rate will extensively slow down. In hibernation, the tissues and cells are protected against oxidative stress damage because the metabolism shifts towards the minimal need for oxygen and nutrition. The cell also have the ability to cool down the temperatures just above the freezing point without cell damage, but it is impossible since, based on the movie, Fenris was clearly killed not long after Hela vanished to hell by Odin. Not to mention that her body was stored probably many years or even decades before Hela returned and resurrected her. So Fenris should be quite shortly dead, either brain or metabolically. It is also impossible to hibernate organism cells and organs when the organism is dead. When an organism dies, the breathing mechanism stops and the oxygen is depleted in cells.
Besides, at the molecular cell level, cells autolysis will occur and then lead to decomposition of corpse. But for Fenris, they might have kept her body at an extreme cold place, so her body was relatively unaffected. For restoration to happen, the cells must undergo all processes and repair the damage through a complex operations. If I'm not mistaken, there's also no way that apoptosis can be reversed once the enzymes capace fragments those cellular protein.
It It is possible that Fenris' well-preserved cells went through a process known as cell anastasis, which is a naturally cell recovery phenomenon that rescues cells from the brink of death. Research has shown how cells pose to recover even as they are dying. This process has also been proved to be able to rescue cells following a variety of insults, including cold shock, protein starvation, and exposure to toxic chemicals. In cells that have advanced to the late stage apoptosis, fragmented mitochondria can even fuse and regain their normal structures. Recovering cells also lose the eat me signal from the surface after only a few hours, thus escaping phagocytosis. I also remember there was a scientist called Dr. Robert E. Cornish who conducted a groundbreaking yet extremely controversial experiment on dogs in 1934, as his experiment was not permitted to be carried out on humans.
Yes, I remember reading this article about him, and he has actually tried many different methods before finally achieving success for the following one. He would use nitrogen or ether to suffocate the animal first, then attempt to rescue them within 5 minutes after the heart stopping. To do so, he developed a method of keeping the blood constantly flowing by using a teeterboard, which is a kind of seesaw to rock the patient up and down and maintaining the patient's blood circulation. However, there were some requirements to meet in order to achieve this, in which one is to inject the patient with some anticoagulant as well as steroids.
Unfortunately for him, though he was successful in reviving a few dogs, the effects only appeared and continued for a brief time afterward. One of the dogs in the experiment was in a coma for 8 hours before it passed away again, whilst the other was resurrected with brain damage and blindness. Although Cornish did confirm that the latter dog was restored to normal strength within a few months. Unfortunately for Dr. Cornish again, this series of experiments and studies were widely panned, and he was expelled from the UCLA laboratory after they learned about the protests on the dog killings. He eventually had to conduct the experiments in his house and had to change his subjects to pigs instead of dogs.
But I think there was a piece of extremely strong evidence which just emerged around 2 years ago, whereby a group of researchers from Yale University has been working on reanimating dead pig's brain a few hours after pig dies in a slaughterhouse and make sure that their brain were kept full of blood and kept at room temperature up to 6 hours. The group of scientists were able to recover many of the quite lifeless brain cellular activity as well as some metabolic activity. However, while some brain cells have started to function again, the pigs were still unable to restore consciousness. This reversible process eventually leads to several questions into what it actually means to be alive or dead. Whether it is when an organism's brain activities have halted or when the heartbeat is not detected.
This eventually leads us back to our conclusion, in which Hela's pet wolf Fenris has died shortly after Hela was sealed by Odin. Hela only returned after Odin passed away to resurrect Fenris. This timeline has proved that Fenris was killed a long time ago, and to be scientific, Fenris is impossible to be revived since his condition is way harsher than the experiments we mentioned just now. There are normally two categories of legal determination of death, either cardiopulmonary death, which is irreversible cessation of heartbeat, and brain death, which is irreversible cessation of functions of the brain. In Fenris' case, both her heartbeat and brain activity should have been halted, so she is definitely dead. Although there are several studies that have further proved that death is not an irreversible process, for Fenris' condition, she is way too dead to be resurrected under any sort of treatment, either through electric shocks or chemical injections.
Wow, I can't believe that there are so many concepts that could be related to this single movie. I would love to have more of these kinds of brainstorming sessions with you guys next time. And thank you for sharing all these information. I definitely learned a lot from you guys. But for now, I have to complete my assignment first. Talk to you guys soon.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Session.